The history of insomnia in America is not merely a medical chronicle. It is a profound cultural story about how an entire society fundamentally changed its relationship with the night. To understand the Great American Sleep Epidemic, we must first travel back to an age where the idea of an 8-hour, uninterrupted sleep was virtually unheard of. A time ruled by the sun, the hearth, and a sleeping pattern so natural it was woven into the fabric of life. Segmented sleep. In the colonial and early Federalist periods of the United States, stretching from the 17th to the mid-19th century, the hours after sunset were not an endless stretch of darkness to be feared or fought against, but a multi-stage process of rest, lacking the persistent, powerful artificial lighting that would later characterize the industrial age. Early Americans lived by a rhythm that historians now call biphasic or segmented sleep. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the short-lived, precious light from pine knots, tallow candles, and whale oil lamps became too dim or expensive to sustain, the household began its early ritual of rest. Most people retired soon after dusk, often between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. This first, deep slumber was universally known as the first sleep, or sometimes the dead sleep. It was a period of intense, restorative rest, typically lasting 3 to 4 hours. The home itself, often a single-room cabin or a small cramped farmhouse, was an acoustic vessel where all of life, including rest, was communal. Family members, apprentices, or even travelers shared beds or slept in close proximity, making silent, unbroken sleep a physiological impossibility, and crucially a cultural anomaly. Then, sometime around midnight, a change occurred. The first sleep would naturally terminate, and the body would enter a period of calm, contemplative wakefulness that could last for an hour or more. This interlude, known in some historical texts as the watch, was not viewed as a sign of distress or a sleep disorder, a concept that barely existed then, but as a normal, useful part of the night. People would stir, rise from their beds, and engage in a variety of quiet, necessary tasks. In the small, dimly lit space, the head of the house might stoke the dying embers in the fireplace, ensuring the family remained warm until dawn. Housewives, ever burdened with endless labor, might use the quiet hours to churn butter, spin yarn, or prepare food for the next day, their movements illuminated only by the flicker of a fire or a carefully conserved candle. Scholars and poets especially prized this quiet, unhurried time for reflection, prayer, or writing, as the day's clamor was absent and their minds were clear from the first block of sleep. For families and couples, this midnight wakefulness often became a time of quiet intimacy and conversation. Without the constant sensory overload of the modern day, the night hours fostered connection. Neighbors, if close enough, might even call upon one another for a brief, hushed visit before returning to their respective beds. This period was also when concerns and anxieties, from crops to health, were often privately processed. It was a time for reflection on dreams and spiritual matters, reinforced by religious tradition, which often called for a midnight vigil or prayer. Finally, as the body's internal clock naturally wound down from this wakeful interval, the person would return to bed for the second sleep, or morning sleep. This block of rest typically lasted until the sun began to rise, signaling the beginning of the workday. The second sleep was generally lighter and easier to awaken from, perfectly positioning the body to greet the dawn and the demands of farm life or early trade. The entire schedule was an elastic model, bending to the seasons. Shorter nights in the summer meant a later bedtime and less time for the watch, while the long winter darkness encouraged a full, deep embrace of the biphasic rhythm. The importance of this polyphasic schedule lies in its contrast to our current sleep norms. For early Americans, Occasional midnight wakefulness was not the problem, but the solution. It was the body's natural state, synchronized with the lack of persistent light. This pattern ensured that periods of light and darkness dictated life, creating a world where time was cyclical, not linear. This system would remain largely intact, a testament to humanity's natural rhythm until the profound, society-altering disruption that arrived first with cheap gaslight and then, catastrophically, with the invention that would turn night into a prolongable day, the electric light bulb. The coming change would not just shorten the night. It would, over time, dismantle the segmented sleep pattern and transform a natural wakefulness into the disease of insomnia. The age of the first sleep and the second sleep, a gentle, pliable time dictated by the ebb and flow of natural light, was doomed. Its executioner was not a doctor or a disease, but a relentless, impersonal machine, the clock. As America surged into the mid-19th century, driven by steam, steel, and a fierce, relentless belief in progress, the nation fundamentally reorganized its daily life. This reorganization had a hidden, devastating consequence. It weaponized the night and manufactured an epidemic of anxiety that we now recognize as the first wave of modern insomnia. Sleeplessness ceased to be a natural state of being and became, for the first time, a national social crisis. The single most destructive force against the ancient rhythm of segmented sleep was the birth of standard time. Before the 1880s, time was a local affair. When the sun reached its zenith in Boston, it was noon in Boston. But the sun would not hit its zenith in Chicago for another hour and a half, meaning every city, town, and even large farm operated on its own solar schedule. This system, with its inherent elasticity, allowed the segmented sleeper to adjust their night cycle by an hour or two, depending on the season or the evening's tasks. The Industrial Revolution, however, required uniformity, and nothing demanded uniformity more than the railroad, as the continent rapidly laced itself with iron tracks. A journey from New York to St. Louis might require a traveler to reset their watch a dozen times, leading to chaos, missed connections, and tragically fatal collisions. The railroad corporations demanded order. On November 18, 1883, the day that came to be known as the Day of Two Noons, the railroad companies unilaterally imposed 4 standardized time zones across North America, though not codified by Congress until 1918. This date marks the symbolic death of local time. From that moment forward, the nation's temporal master was no longer the sun rising over the horizon, but a set of highly precise, geographically distant clocks. This shift imposed an immense, unyielding rigidity on American life. If you lived in the eastern part of a time zone, the clock told you it was 8 a.m. while the sun had been up for an hour. If you were on the western edge, the clock mandated you start work before the light properly broke. The result was a dramatic compression of rest. Sleep was no longer regulated by the natural biological feeling of exhaustion that arose shortly after sunset. It was regulated by the need to be punctual at a standardized hour. The 9 or 10 hours people had previously dedicated to the entire biphasic night, from early slumber to morning awakening, now had to be consolidated into a single, efficient, pressurized block of monophasic sleep. When the first sleep ended at midnight, there was no time for contemplation. Only the panic of knowing one had to force the second sleep immediately to survive the mechanical tyranny of the 6 a.m. factory start. The changing light was only half the problem. The changing sound of the night was the other. The 19th century city was an acoustic hellscape fundamentally hostile to rest. The natural darkness of the pre-industrial town was matched by a profound, respectful silence, broken only by the chirping of insects, the lowing of cattle, or the rustle of wind. The darkness of the industrial city, however, was filled with a cacophony of anti-sleep machines, factories, running 12, 14, or even 24 hours a day, generated a continuous bone-shaking rumble. The steam engine, the loom, the printing press, and the iron foundry replaced the quiet rhythm of the spinning wheel and the hand loom. The noise of carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones, the shouts of late-night vendors, and the clatter of horse-drawn fire engines were constant interruptions. For residents packed into newly built tenement buildings, especially those near industrial hubs, true quiet became a forgotten luxury. This incessant noise had a direct, measurable impact on the nervous system. The quiet period of the watch in the segmented sleep cycle allowed the nervous system to settle into a state of deep, regenerative calm. The 19th century city denied this respite. Instead, people were kept in a state of hypervigilance, perpetually ready to react to a sudden sound. The factory whistle, the midnight train, the drunkard's row. The sleep they did manage was shallow, interrupted, and profoundly unfulfilling. Doctors began to observe a new kind of patient, the urban dweller suffering from neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, a condition directly linked to the auditory trauma of industrial life. The inability to sleep was no longer a personal fault, but an entirely predictable, physiological response to an environment that refused to let the brain rest. Central to the new sleep crisis was the moral shift surrounding productivity. In the agricultural world, work was dictated by the sun and the seasons. Rest was simply a function of necessity, but in the factory system, time and therefore sleep was money. The factory whistle became the true symbol of the new regime. It was the loud, insistent herald of the workday, piercing through the pre-dawn quiet, demanding that every citizen conform to the needs of the machine. The whistle dictated when rest must end, and by extension, when it should begin. It erased the gentle transition of the segmented night. The worker had to aim for a single block of deep sleep, starting precisely at a late hour, delayed by the new gas and electric light, and ending abruptly at the whistle's shriek. Against this backdrop, the act of sleeping too much, or even simply sleeping inefficiently, became a moral failing. The new Protestant ethic of productivity viewed excessive rest as laziness, a theft of time that rightfully belonged to the engine of industry. Pamphlets and public service announcements stressed the virtue of the early riser, associating long, unbroken sleep with slackness and vice. The ideal citizen was one who could master their bodily needs, forcing the segmented night into a single, neat 8-hour package suitable for maximizing output. If a person woke up at 2 a.m., as their ancestors naturally did during the watch, they now had two options, both fraught with tension. They could attempt to stay awake, but this meant wasting productive time and suffering deep exhaustion later. They had to immediately, anxiously force themselves back into the second sleep. It is here that the modern experience of insomnia was born. The patient struggling to fall back asleep at 2 a.m. was not merely resting in between shifts. They were failing an economic and moral test. They were agonizing over the lost hours of consolidation, desperately trying to trick their biologically wired body back into an unnatural sleep block. The clock was no longer a tool for scheduling. It was a psychological weapon that turned nighttime wakefulness into a source of guilt and panic. While electricity was the ultimate sleep killer, gaslighting preceded it and laid the cultural groundwork for an extended evening. By the mid-19th century, cities like Boston and Baltimore were illuminated by a glow that lasted well past sunset. This new, relatively affordable artificial light served two purposes. It made city streets safer for commerce and socialization, and it fundamentally shifted the social hour. Instead of retiring soon after dusk, the middle and upper classes, and increasingly the urban working class, began to participate in a genuine nightlife. Theaters ran later, social calls extended past 10 p.m., and newspapers could be read long after the natural light failed. This was the true beginning of the social pressure to stay up. The cumulative effect was simple. The bedtime was pushed later, yet the wake-up time remained fixed by the relentless factory whistle or the demands of the standardized workday. The 9-hour segmented night was physically compressed into a 6 or 7-hour block. The body, deprived of its natural rhythm and simultaneously exposed to light, which suppresses the sleep hormone melatonin, rebelled. It was a vicious cycle. The light enabled the work that required the time discipline that denied the rest that the light had already delayed. The medical community, faced with an increasing number of patients complaining of nervousness, exhaustion, and a complete inability to find continuous rest, had to create a new framework. The problem was no longer categorized as a minor inconvenience, but as a widespread ailment reflective of a strained civilization. The anxiety of the new chronology gave rise to what became the defining malady of the late 19th century, neurasthenia. Coined by American neurologist George Beard in 1869, neurasthenia was the quintessential Victorian illness, described as a deficiency of nervous energy caused by the wear and tear of civilization. It was blamed on everything from the telegraph and the rapid-fire journalism of the day to the complexity of urban life and, most prominently, the lack of restful sleep. Insomnia, then, became the defining symptom of this new social contract. It was proof that the pace of American industrialization was unsustainable, that the relentless ticking of the clock was literally fraying the nerves of the citizenry. For the middle and upper classes, insomnia was interpreted as a sign of intellectual overwork, a badge of honor worn by those whose minds were too refined, too active, and too sensitive for the vulgar demands of sleep. For the working classes, it was simply exhaustion, the byproduct of bodies beaten into submission by 12-hour shifts and minds too alert from the surrounding noise to settle. In both cases, the segmented sleeper, who once accepted 2 periods of rest bridged by quiet work, was now seen as the victim of a modern pathology. The peaceful 2 a.m. wakefulness had become a torturous, anxiety-ridden event, framed by the overwhelming dread of the morning whistle. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how Americans worked. It changed how they slept, or more accurately, how they failed to sleep. By imposing a rigid, mechanical chronology, filling the night with noise and moralizing productivity, it created the perfect conditions for chronic insomnia to flourish. The natural, resilient rhythm of the segmented night was broken, leaving behind a nation on edge, desperately seeking a cure for the very civilization it had built. The stage was now set for the medical community to step in with its own bizarre and often dangerous solutions. The Industrial Revolution, with its clattering machinery and standardized clocks, had stripped the nation of its natural segmented sleep rhythm. Yet as the 19th century matured into the rigidly moralizing Victorian era, the resulting sleeplessness underwent a further, crucial transformation. It became profoundly and disproportionately gendered. The inability to sleep was no longer merely a symptom of a socially strained civilization. It was recast as a defining attribute of the Victorian woman, a delicate, oversensitized creature whose failure to rest was proof of her physical and intellectual frailty. To understand the Victorian female relationship with insomnia, one must first grasp the all-encompassing nature of neurasthenia and hysteria. These were the medical and cultural catch-all terms that defined female suffering and, by extension, female rest. Neurasthenia, as codified by American neurologist George Beard in 1869, was the diagnosis of the modern age. It was defined as a depletion of the body's nervous force, an energy source believed to be consumed by the stress of competition, complex thought, and rapid urbanization. While men suffered from neurasthenia due to the rigors of the marketplace and professional strain, their condition was usually temporary and treatable through vigorous activity or travel. Their exhaustion was seen as a depletion of muscle and will. For women, the narrative was entirely different. Insomnia and the nervous exhaustion it engendered were seen as inherent, often perpetual defects. Their condition was interpreted not as the result of working too hard, but of being too sensitive and too idle simultaneously. Middle and upper-class women, shielded from manual labor, were perceived to have too much cerebral energy and not enough physical outlet. Their brains were too easily stimulated by novels, social obligations, or most dangerously, intellectual pursuits. This condition of chronic irritability and restlessness was seen less as a reaction to their environment and more as a reflection of their fragile, distinctly female anatomy. Underpinning the neurasthenic diagnosis for women was the ancient and persistent specter of hysteria. From the Greek root hystera, womb, this condition maintained its theoretical link to the female reproductive system well into the late 19th century. Doctors believed that a woman's entire emotional and physical stability was governed by her reproductive organs. In this medical framework, the uterus was the seat of feeling, and any emotional disturbance, an unfulfilled desire, an unhappy marriage, or even an overabundance of piety, could cause the nerves emanating from the womb to wander and wreak havoc across the body. Sleeplessness in this context was the brain's mirror image of the hysterical uterus, a state of perpetual, anxious agitation that could not be calmed. A woman complaining of insomnia was rarely treated for a simple sleep deficit. She was treated for nerves. Her wakefulness was pathologized not as a physical issue, like poor breathing or pain, but as a moral and emotional one. The diagnosis served to reinforce the prevailing gender roles. A truly healthy woman was emotionally placid, physically submissive, and therefore easily asleep. The woman who could not sleep was, by definition, an anxious, overstimulated, and possibly unbalanced individual. The medical literature of the era is rife with this gendered bias. Male insomnia was often linked to overwork, investment losses, or political stress, the noble battles of the public sphere. Female insomnia, however, was frequently attributed to domestic dissatisfaction, the emotional strain of managing a large household or an unhappy conjugal life, intellectual overload, reading too much, studying too hard, or engaging in serious non-domestic thought, physical confinement, a lack of vigorous outdoor activity due to fashion, corsets, heavy skirts, and social propriety, leading to a buildup of nervous energy. The physical environment of the Victorian woman compounded her sleeplessness. While the factory worker was robbed of sleep by the whistle, the middle-class wife was a victim of her domestic status. The ideal Victorian home was a sanctuary, a soft, cushioned retreat from the harsh realities of the industrial world. But for the woman expected to manage and occupy this space, the sanctuary could become a prison. Victorian social codes demanded that respectable women cultivate an aura of delicacy and refinement. This translated into a lifestyle marked by physical restriction. Restrictive clothing, the corset, cinching the waist and restricting lung capacity, made deep restorative breathing difficult, compounding physical tension. Sedentary lifestyle. Walking and moderate exercise were encouraged, but anything strenuous was frowned upon as unseemly and detrimental to the nervous constitution. The cult of sickness. A certain fragility became fashionable, suggesting a woman was too refined for the vulgarities of robust health. Chronic low-level ailments, often stemming from poor diet and lack of exercise, led to perpetual restlessness and an inability to settle into deep rest. When a woman, physically constricted and mentally restless, took to her elaborate curtained bed, her sleeplessness was inevitable. Her body, trained in perpetual tension and denied release, simply could not switch off the high alert state induced by anxiety and physical constraint. The inability to sleep was thus proof that she was indeed the fragile, highly strung creature society claimed her to be, trapping her in a cycle of delicacy and illness. The Victorian diagnosis of insomnia gained immense cultural power through its application to women who dared to challenge traditional roles, most famously writers and reformers. If the domestic woman's mind was overstimulated by drawing room conversation, the intellectual woman's mind was deemed catastrophically overloaded by serious thought. To pursue education, write professionally, or advocate for women's rights was, in the Victorian medical view, to risk utter nervous collapse. The brain, doctors argued, possessed a finite amount of energy. If this energy was directed toward unnatural tasks like abstract reasoning or public speaking, it would be stolen from the essential female functions, reproduction and emotional balance, resulting in hysteria and, invariably, persistent insomnia. The sleepless feminist became a cautionary archetype. Her restlessness was not evidence of a lively, engaged mind, but a sign of a pathological rebellion against her biological destiny. The only cure offered for such a condition was a return to the prescribed domestic sphere, a withdrawal from stimulation and enforced rest, the very tools that were about to be weaponized into the era's most famous and most controversial treatment. Dr. Weir Mitchell's Rest Cure. Before the famous rest cure took center stage, the immediate medical response to the sleepless neurasthenic woman was pharmacological. The goal was simple: sedate the overactive female brain. This led to the wide adoption of powerful, often addictive chemical agents that promised immediate relief from nerves. The most common treatments included opium and morphine, easily accessible in patent medicines like soothing syrups and laudanum. These derivatives were prescribed liberally for nervous complaints. They provided a temporary, chemically induced oblivion, but their addictive nature meant that the cure quickly became worse than the disease. Withdrawal often intensified the underlying anxiety and insomnia, creating a desperate cyclical dependency. Bromides. Potassium bromide became a popular, gentler sedative, though massive doses were often required to induce sleep. Chronic bromide use, however, led to toxic effects, including mental dullness, skin rashes, and a general decline in cognitive function, all of which could be easily misinterpreted by doctors as further signs of the patient's underlying nervousness. Alcohol and tonics. Countless nerve tonics and female restoratives were marketed, many containing high concentrations of alcohol, as much as 40 proof, combined with various narcotics. These were prescribed as a daily regimen to keep the woman calm and compliant, ensuring her brain did not stray from the path of placid submission. In essence, the Victorian doctor's response to female insomnia was to chemically reinforce the societal demand for passivity. The restless brain was not to be understood or treated holistically. It was to be silenced, subdued, and forced into submission through whatever means necessary, all under the banner of calming the nerves. The stage was now perfectly set for the most extreme expression of this medical philosophy: The institutionalization of enforced submission and idleness, which promised to rebuild the frayed nervous system from the ground up. The ultimate irony of the Victorian malady lay in the medical establishment's failure to recognize the real source of the female sleeplessness. The nerves were indeed frayed, but not from inherent constitutional weakness. They were frayed by powerlessness, lack of agency, social confinement, and intellectual repression. The woman who suffered from insomnia was often the one who felt the profound psychological strain of a society that prized her beauty and delicacy while denying her meaningful expression or purposeful work. Her sleeplessness was not a sign of her brain malfunctioning, but of her brain rebelling against the restrictive box of Victorian domesticity. By gendering insomnia and blaming it on a delicate or hysterical nature, the medical and social systems neatly deflected attention from the true structural pressures of the age: the boredom of the middle-class wife, the crushing expectations of motherhood, the moralization of every waking and sleeping moment, and the simple fact that a life lived without physical exertion or intellectual outlet is profoundly exhausting. The consequence was a century-long legacy where female fatigue, restlessness, and anxiety, the very symptoms of modern life, were dismissed as mere emotional instability, setting the stage for decades of misdiagnosis and harmful paternalistic cures. The next chapter would see this paternalism reach its apex, leading to a confrontation that would redefine the medical landscape forever. The clamor of the factory whistle and the oppressive standardization of the temporal clock had created a new species of human, the patient who could not rest. But if society had manufactured the condition, the medical profession was now forced to classify, diagnose, and ultimately profit from it. The mid-19th century physician faced a profound dilemma. The complaints of insomnia, restlessness, and chronic exhaustion were agonizingly real, yet they lacked any visible organic cause. There were no lesions, no fever, no physical markers for this invisible foe. Sleeplessness forced medicine to abandon its centuries-old reliance on observable anatomy, and, for the first time, to formally grapple with the subtle, chaotic influence of the human mind on the body. This era marks the true transition of sleep-related problems from the realm of folk remedy and spiritual malaise into the domain of formalized medical analysis. It was a chaotic, often erroneous journey defined by the invention of nervous exhaustion and the elusive yet powerful concept of sleep debt. For centuries, the inability to sleep was explained through classical theories of the body, most notably the theory of humors, or by spiritual concepts. A sleepless night might be attributed to an imbalance of bile, a poor diet, an excess of phlegm, or simply a troubled conscience. The remedies were equally straightforward: opium for sedation, herbs for calming, and prayer for the soul. These remedies, and the frameworks they supported, were designed for a world where fatigue was episodic, a natural consequence of a hard season or a temporary illness. They were utterly inadequate for the chronic, pervasive exhaustion born of industrialization. The new patient was not temporarily fatigued, they were fundamentally frayed. They slept fitfully, woke up terrified, and felt the exhaustion pile up day after day. The traditional medical toolkit, the leech, the purge, the simple tincture, offered no lasting relief. Doctors realized they were facing something systemic, something that stemmed not from a failing organ, but from a failing interaction between the body and its hyperspeed environment. This intellectual vacuum demanded a new specialty: neurology. As the study of the nervous system emerged as a discipline separate from general medicine, Doctors began to conceptualize the body as a complex electrical machine and the mind as the engine running this machine. Sleeplessness in this new light was not a problem of the stomach or the soul, but a problem of the wiring. The brain, constantly bombarded by the stimuli of urban life, the demands of the clock and the anxieties of capitalist competition, simply could not switch off the current. The pivotal moment in the medical formalization of insomnia came with the work of American neurologist George Beard. In 1869, Beard codified a new condition that perfectly captured the zeitgeist of the anxious age: neurasthenia, literally nerve weakness. Beard argued that the American, particularly the middle and upper-class American, suffered from a condition unique to modern, high-pressure civilization. His central thesis was that the body possessed a finite amount of nervous force, or vital energy, which flowed along the nerves like electricity through wires. In primitive societies, this energy was conserved, but in the technologically advanced, competitive, post-Civil War American environment, it was rapidly and recklessly depleted. The primary culprits, according to Beard, were the great engines of modernization, the telegraph and telephone. These technologies subjected the nervous system to unnaturally rapid communication and demand. The railroad, the speed and noise of mechanized travel physically jarred the nerves. The stock market and competition, the intense mental strain of financial risk and intellectual struggle, drained the brain battery. Insomnia was not merely a symptom of neurasthenia. It was the hallmark of its severity. Beard described the neurasthenic insomniac as an individual whose nerves were so depleted, yet simultaneously so hypersensitive, that they could not find repose. The brain lacked the necessary force to maintain normal functions during the day, yet retained just enough errant energy to prevent the profound quiescence required for rest. Beard wrote extensively on the sleeplessness of his patients. They would fall into the first sleep, only to wake in terror at midnight, unable to return to the second sleep because their exhausted yet irritated brain became hyper-aware of every minor sensation: the faint ticking of a clock, the distant rumble of a train, or the internal anxiety of an overstimulated mind. Beard's diagnosis was revolutionary because it accomplished two things. It legitimized the suffering. It gave a scientific, formal name, neurasthenia, to complaints that might otherwise have been dismissed as moral weakness or laziness. The sleepless patient could now say, "My nervous force is depleted," rather than, "I can't fall back asleep after the watch." It reinforced the social narrative. It validated the belief that the person suffering was a sensitive, intelligent victim of progress, someone whose mind was too fine for the crude realities of industrial life. This reinforced the idea that high-status individuals were the most susceptible, further cementing sleeplessness as a societal preoccupation. With neurasthenia established as a clinical syndrome, the next step was to find its physical mechanism. Early doctors attempted to use the new tools of science to locate the cause of sleep, and thus the cause of its failure, in the measurable body. This led to a series of fascinating yet ultimately incorrect physiological theories. One of the oldest scientific ideas proposed that sleep was caused by changes in the brain's blood volume. Insomnia, therefore, was a misregulation of the circulation. The anemia hypothesis. Some doctors believed sleep was caused by the brain becoming anemic, lacking blood. The blood would rush to the stomach for digestion, or to the limbs during daytime activity, leaving the brain quiet. The insomniac, in this view, had a defective system where blood stubbornly remained in the cranium, keeping the brain too active and hot, the congestion hypothesis. Conversely, Other physicians argued that sleep was caused by a congestion or flooding of blood in the brain, which suppressed neural activity. The insomniac failed to achieve this necessary vascular stasis. Doctors attempted to cure insomnia by manipulating blood flow, prescribing cold baths for the feet to draw blood away from the head, or using various sedatives thought to relax the cerebral arteries. The contradictory nature of these theories, and their general failure to produce reliable cures, highlighted the fact that sleep was far more complex than a simple plumbing problem. The rise of chemistry in the mid-19th century led to the hypothesis that sleep was a mild, predictable form of autointoxication. The theory proposed that wakefulness produced certain metabolic waste products, like lactic acid, urea, or other unnamed hypnotoxins. During the day, these products built up. When they reached a critical mass, they acted as a narcotic, poisoning the brain into sleep. During sleep, these toxins were cleared. Insomnia, then, was the failure of the body to either produce the necessary quantity of sleep toxins or the failure of the nervous system to succumb to them. This led to bizarre treatments focused on cleansing the body, involving aggressive purges, strict diets, and prolonged confinement to prevent the body from metabolizing too quickly and burning off the required sleep chemicals. This toxicological perspective would later inform the development of chemical sleep aids, as doctors sought to replace the body's failed natural toxin with a synthetic one. The doctor's dilemma was compounded by the growing cultural obsession with time efficiency. If the segmented night was flexible and qualitative, the new industrial night had to be rigid and quantifiable. Medical texts began to argue fiercely for a new, fixed norm for rest, a consolidation that settled by the 1880s, firmly around the 8-hour ideal. This rigidity gave birth to the conceptual reality of sleep debt. Though the term was not modern, the concept that any deviation below the required minimum hours of consolidated rest created a cumulative deficit that must be repaid became a powerful diagnostic tool. The physician now measured the patient's condition not just by visible signs, but by a psychological subtraction. The required rest, 8 hours. The actual rest, 5 hours. Cause, sleep debt, 3 hours. This quantified failure heightened the insomniac's anxiety. The patient knew precisely how much they were losing, and that loss translated directly into missed work, social failure, and a further drain on their nervous force. The peaceful segmented awakening of their ancestors was now the clinical symptom of nocturnal arousal, a failure of the brain to perform the necessary consolidation demanded by the industrial clock doctors. Unable to treat the invisible cause, began to treat the measurable symptom. They insisted on longer and longer periods of forced rest to repay the perceived debt. This therapeutic pressure often backfired. Telling a patient, "You must sleep for 8 hours," is the most effective way to ensure they do not, as the very effort to achieve sleep generates paralyzing performance anxiety. By the 1880s, the medical establishment found itself in an unstable equilibrium. Diagnosis: neurasthenia was a widely accepted, scientific explanation for the exhaustion of the age. Mechanism: physiological theories, vascular, toxic, were intellectually stimulating but therapeutically weak. Result: doctors had defined the problem of sleeplessness as a failure of the nervous system to handle modern life, but they lacked a pharmaceutical bullet or a surgical fix. This therapeutic vacuum led to a profound shift. If the environment, the noisy city, the anxious life was the cause and the body could not be chemically fixed, then the patient's behavior and environment had to be drastically controlled. The physician's role evolved from simply diagnosing a condition to imposing a total regimen, a complete re-engineering of the patient's existence. This realization paved the way for the era's most drastic yet medically respected intervention, the forced withdrawal from modern civilization and the systematic re-education of the nervous system. The stage was now set for Silas Weir Mitchell to step out of the shadows of George Beard's theoretical work and impose a draconian, all-encompassing cure designed to shock the shattered Victorian nervous system back into line. The doctor's dilemma was solved not with a scalpel or a pill, but with a total, absolute surrender of the patient's will. If the industrial age created the anxious insomniac and the Victorian doctor formally diagnosed her as neurasthenic, it was the booming, unregulated American marketplace that offered the first, immediate and utterly devastating solution: the demand for oblivion, for a guaranteed escape from the tyranny of the clock and the trauma of nerves, created a commercial gold rush. Sleep was sold not as a medical treatment, but as a miracle commodity packaged in sweet syrups, sparkling elixirs, and cheerful bottles, each containing a chemical siren song of oblivion. The period from the 1850s to the turn of the 20th century was the age of the patent medicine, a time when the desperate search for rest transformed into a national epidemic of self-medication and unacknowledged addiction. Lacking effective regulation, the American public was handed the most potent sedatives known to man, disguised as harmless tonics and restorative tinctures. The sleepless consumer traded their anxiety for a temporary, dangerous dependency, forging a chemical pact with the dark side of American enterprise. The patent medicine industry thrived on two core conditions: the rising epidemic of nervous exhaustion and the profound, unregulated freedom of the American press. Doctors' fees were high, and their remedies were often painful or complex. The patent medicine, by contrast, was cheap, readily available, and promised results instantly with catchy, comforting names. These concoctions were called patent medicines, though they were rarely patented in the modern sense. Their formulations were kept secret, relying on trademark protection rather than ingredient disclosure. The manufacturers used aggressive, ubiquitous advertising campaigns that flooded newspapers, magazines, and almanacs. These advertisements did not merely sell medicine. They sold a narrative of liberation. They spoke directly to the exhausted housewife, the overwhelmed businessman, and the sleepless infant, assuring them that their suffering was common and their cure was waiting on the nearest drugstore shelf. The advertising was ruthless in its target, the neurasthenic woman. Ads often featured frail, pale women gazing listlessly out of windows, juxtaposed with images of the same woman, restored to rosy-cheeked health thanks to the advertised elixir. The message was clear: your anxiety is a weakness, but our tonic is the strength you need. The lack of federal regulation meant that manufacturers could claim their product cured everything, from cancer and consumption to simple female complaints, and no one could legally stop them. The crucial danger of this commercial blitz lay in what the bottles did not disclose. The most effective ingredient in any sleep tonic was always a potent, addictive narcotic. These manufacturers understood that a product that truly worked, that delivered a reliable, repeatable feeling of calm and sleep, was one that would guarantee repeat purchases. And nothing delivered a more reliable cure for sleeplessness than the family of chemicals derived from the poppy. The vast majority of 19th century sleep aids, nerve tonics, and pain relievers relied on one of three classes of potent, habit-forming substances, each masquerading under a benign name. Opium was the king of the 19th century medicine cabinet. It was cheap, legal, and highly effective as a sedative and analgesic. It appeared in the form of laudanum, an alcohol tincture of opium, crude opium pills, and various specialized syrups. Disguise and delivery. The genius of the patent medicine purveyors was in disguising the bitter taste of opium. They mixed it with sugar, spices, and, most commonly, sweet-flavored alcohol to create palatable liquids. This made opium consumption not only medically accepted, but socially benign. The woman seeking rest was not purchasing a narcotic. She was buying Dr. Johnson's restorative drops or Mrs. Smith's soothing solution. The unacknowledged addiction. Opium use was particularly rampant among middle and upper-class women. Unable to sleep due to the pressures of neurasthenia, and unwilling to admit to a moral failing, they found solace in these readily available bottles. Unlike the social stigma associated with the marginalized figures of the opium den, the addiction cultivated in the parlor through these patent medicines was respectable, hidden, and medically condoned. The woman believed she was treating her nerves when in fact, she was simply feeding a deepening physiological dependency. When she inevitably woke in the middle of the night, her dose wearing off, her body craving more, her initial anxiety about sleeplessness was replaced by the torment of withdrawal. Many popular tonics contained stunningly high levels of alcohol, often disguised as natural spirits or pure grain spirits. The alcohol content in many bitters and elixirs often rivaled or exceeded that of modern whiskey, sometimes reaching 40% to % alcohol by volume. The sedative effect. The immediate effect of this alcohol was a relaxation of the muscles and a suppression of nervous activity, inducing a quick if superficial sleep. For the woman suffering from the physical tension of the Victorian corset and the mental tension of social confinement, a daily dose of an alcohol-laden tonic offered immediate relief. The hidden trap. The consumer was not just addicted to the narcotic effect. They were becoming chronic alcohol abusers without ever believing they drank. When a woman began to suffer from the classic signs of alcoholism, slurred speech, physical unsteadiness, or chronic dependency, her symptoms were invariably folded back into her original diagnosis of hysteria or neurasthenia. The doctor concluded, her nerves are simply worsening, prescribing more of the tonic, thereby deepening the spiral of addiction. As the century wore on, and the dangers of opium and alcohol became marginally more recognized, doctors and manufacturers turned to inorganic chemistry for a safer solution. Potassium bromide became the next major sleep agent. Bromides are central nervous system depressants. In the 1870s and 1880s, they were widely embraced as a modern scientific fix for chronic anxiety and sleeplessness. Products like Bromedia were marketed directly to the medical profession and the public as the non-narcotic solution. The toxic toll. While not as physically addictive as opium, chronic bromide use was deeply damaging. Prolonged consumption led to a condition called bromism, characterized by severe cognitive impairment, confusion, slurred speech, hallucinations, and chronic skin rashes. The ultimate effect was mental and physical dullness. Patients were less anxious but also less functional. The physician often mistook the symptoms of bromism for the progression of the patient's original neurasthenia, further increasing the dosage in a futile attempt to subdue the nerves. The scientific cure often left the patient in a state of semi-catatonic submission. The darkest chapter in the history of early sleep aids involves the deliberate administration of narcotics to infants. The Victorian era was characterized by high infant mortality and persistent anxiety about the fragility of childhood health. A crying, restless baby represented a crisis of competence for the mother. and a threat to the family's peace. Manufacturers exploited this fear mercilessly. The most famous and notorious of these was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Marketed explicitly for infants suffering from teething, colic, and general restlessness, this syrup promised to regulate the bowels and ensure sweet rest. The main active ingredients? Morphine sulfate and alcohol. The deadly efficacy. The syrup worked flawlessly. A few drops would quiet the most distraught baby, inducing a deep, peaceful sleep. The mother, relieved of her immediate anxiety, was convinced of the product's restorative power. Widespread infant addiction and death. The tragic reality was that countless infants developed chronic morphine dependency from daily doses, often suffering fatal overdoses. When an infant was unusually drowsy or failed to wake up, the causes were often misattributed to a sudden, acute illness rather than the slow, cumulative poisoning by the morphine. The syrup created a generation of tiny addicts, their restlessness intensifying as the drug wore off, leading to a vicious cycle that was only broken by the slow, painful realization that the cure was, in fact, the poison. The widespread availability of these potent sedatives complicated the social perception of addiction, creating a hidden, respectable dependency that coexisted with the marginalized drug use of the opium den. The opium den. This public space, usually associated with Chinese immigrants in urban centers, became the focus of moral panic and criminalization. Addiction here was seen as a moral decay, a vice associated with racial and class difference. The patent medicine cabinet, the parlor, the kitchen, and the nursery, however, housed a vast and more pervasive form of addiction. The woman discreetly sipping her restorative tonic was viewed as an invalid seeking health, not an addict seeking a fix. Her dependency was sanctioned by the press, by the drugstore, and often by her own doctor. This duality meant that the American society of the late 19th century was fundamentally awash in narcotics. Morphine, alcohol, and bromide consumption were normalized, woven into the fabric of daily life under the guise of therapeutic necessity. The insomniac, seeking to escape the terror of wakefulness, had merely exchanged one form of chronic anxiety, sleeplessness, for another, often far more debilitating one, chemical dependency. The chemical bargain offered by the market was ruinous. Guaranteed oblivion now, for a mortgaged future of dependence. The extent of this self-inflicted chemical crisis was not fully quantified until investigative journalists and early public health advocates began to expose the staggering ingredient lists of these popular cures. Figures like Samuel Hopkins Adams and his exposé, The Great American Fraud, 1905, revealed the criminal negligence and outright deception behind the patent medicine trade. The public outcry over infants' deaths, the ruin of countless middle-class lives through addiction, and the medical community's embarrassment over its own complicity finally created the political will for reform. This widespread chemical tragedy, born from the simple, desperate need for sleep, was a major catalyst for the eventual passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. But by then, the damage was done. A generation of insomniacs had been conditioned to believe that rest could only be achieved through chemical intervention. They had exchanged the natural, flexible pattern of segmented sleep for a mandatory and chemically enforced block of unconsciousness. The stage was set for the next extreme measure, a non-chemical cure so drastic, so confining, and so controlling that it sought not just to induce sleep, but to fundamentally remake the patient's body and will, the rest cure. By the 1880s, the battle for the American nervous system was being fought on three distinct fronts: the toxic warfare of the patent medicine aisle, the authoritarian confinement of the rest cure, and, increasingly, the shadowy theater of the mind. As traditional medicine struggled to cure the chronic insomniac with pills or physical subjugation, the desperation for an alternative opened the door to a controversial, yet compelling, solution: hypnosis. The rise of hypnotism, or mesmerism, as it was often still popularly known, as a therapeutic tool for nervous complaints, was a direct acknowledgement that the root of sleeplessness might not be depleted nervous force, but a mind trapped in a state of perpetual anxious overstimulation. If the conscious will was too weak to command sleep, perhaps the unconscious mind could be persuaded. This phase of the sleep epidemic saw the doctor transform from a purveyor of chemical sedatives or a physical jailer into a master of suggestion, attempting to talk the patient back into slumber. The roots of therapeutic hypnotism stretched back to the 18th century and the flamboyant, often theatrical, work of Austrian physician Franz Mesmer, who proposed that animal magnetism, an invisible, natural force, could be transferred to induce a curative trance. By the Victorian era, mesmerism had devolved into a popular stage spectacle, yet the underlying psychological phenomenon remained a powerful curiosity for serious scientific minds. In America, the widespread interest in spiritualism, mind reading, and the hidden life of the subconscious provided a fertile ground for the acceptance of hypnotic suggestion. The public was primed to believe in unseen forces acting upon the mind, and the neurasthenic patient, exhausted by their own conscious efforts to control their anxiety, was profoundly receptive to the idea of external, effortless mental direction. The shift from parlor trick to professional treatment began in earnest in the late 19th century, driven by European schools of thought. The Nancy School, led by Hippolyte Bernheim, which emphasized suggestion as the primary mechanism, and the Salpêtrière School, led by Jean-Martin Charcot, who viewed hypnosis as a neurological phenomenon linked to hysteria. American doctors, keenly observing these debates, began to tentatively incorporate hypnotic techniques into their treatment of functional nervous disorders, the catch-all term for ailments like hysteria, paralysis, and, most frequently, chronic insomnia. In a world where patients were terrified of addiction to opium and the crushing dependency of the rest cure, hypnotism offered a tantalizing promise: sleep without poison. The hypnotic treatment for insomnia usually followed a consistent protocol. Establishing trust and authority. The physician established a calm, authoritative presence necessary to induce the state of suggestibility. The environment was crucial: darkened rooms, quiet and comfort, the opposite of the noisy, bright world the patient sought to escape. The induction, using fixed gaze, monotonous tone, or rhythmic passes, a remnant of mesmerism, the doctor guided the patient into a trance state. The suggestion. Once in the trance, the doctor began the therapeutic commands. For the insomniac, these suggestions were direct and aimed at undoing the conscious performance anxiety that plagued them. Phrases might include: "Your mind is now quiet. The need to think has passed. You will go to sleep naturally and calmly. You will wake only when the sun rises, feeling completely refreshed." Post-hypnotic command. Crucially, the doctor implanted suggestions designed to work after the trance, often emphasizing the patient's regained self-control. This was vital for the Victorian patient, who needed to believe they were restoring their own moral and physical strength, not relying on a chemical crutch. The initial results were often dramatic. Patients who had not slept soundly for months, tortured by the anxiety of their own failing will, would sink into a deep, consolidated sleep under the doctor's command. For a brief, blissful period, the terror of the midnight watch was gone. Hypnotism's popularity highlighted a crucial aspect of the sleep epidemic that the rest cure failed to address, the psychological loop of performance anxiety. The industrial ethic had taught the insomniac two things: sleep is a mandatory, productive task, 8 hours. Failure to perform this task is a personal, moral failing, neurasthenia. The moment the patient lay down, the performance began. Every hour of wakefulness was a failure, and the anxiety about failing to sleep became the single greatest impediment to achieving it. This is the paradox of insomnia, and it is precisely where the hypnotic suggestion was most effective. By surrendering control to the hypnotist, the patient momentarily broke this performance anxiety loop. The burden of trying to sleep was transferred to the doctor. The sleep, when it came, was achieved through passive submission, removing the destructive hyperconscious effort that had previously kept the mind relentlessly alert. Furthermore, hypnotism was used to treat the psychological symptoms that exacerbated sleeplessness. Hysterical paralysis, suggesting that the affected limb could move again. Chronic pain, relieving the mental focus on pain, thereby allowing the body to relax. Obsessive worry, brooding. Commands aimed at quieting the internal monologue that kept the patient awake during the former watch hour. Despite its initial promise, hypnotism never fully eclipsed the pharmaceutical or physical cures. It faced significant cultural and medical limitations that ultimately relegated it to a niche treatment. The results were often temporary. A patient might sleep perfectly for a few days, only to relapse as the original environmental and psychological pressures returned. Many doctors, steeped in the anatomical and organic certainty of the German medical model, viewed hypnosis as inherently unscientific, a mere trick of suggestion rather than a true physical cure. They feared its association with showmanship and quackery. Mitchell himself distrusted the method, preferring the physical, tangible control of the rest cure. For the Victorian middle class, the idea of surrendering the will, even for health, was deeply unsettling. While the rest cure achieved submission through force, hypnotism achieved it through suggestion, creating a moral and ethical gray zone. Was the hypnotist controlling the soul? Was the patient truly healed if they only slept because someone else commanded it? This anxiety about the vulnerability of the subconscious mind led to a cultural caution, slowing its widespread adoption. Hypnotism, like neurasthenia itself, was overwhelmingly applied to the anxious middle and upper classes, particularly women. It was a cure that required language, reflection, and the acknowledgement of a subtle internal life. It was not seen as a solution for the factory worker whose exhaustion was purely physical, though their sleep was equally consolidated by artificial light and industrial schedules. This reinforced the idea that insomnia, especially the nervous, persistent kind, was a sophisticated malady of the refined American temperament. The most lasting impact of the hypnotic movement on the history of insomnia was not the technique itself, but the introduction of the subconscious into the medical conversation. Hypnotism taught doctors that there was a vast, hidden territory of the mind, a storehouse of buried anxieties and suppressed traumas that actively interfered with the body's rest. This realization would prove transformative. The sleeplessness of the Victorian age was no longer merely a problem of blood flow or nervous depletion. It was a symptom of repression. The quiet hours of the night, previously used for calm reflection during the segmented watch, had become a terrifying time when the individual was left alone with their unacknowledged fears. The mind, unable to face these demons consciously, manifested its distress through sleeplessness. The failures of hypnotism, its temporary nature and the social discomfort it caused, did not stop the exploration of the hidden mind. Instead, they paved the way for the next great wave of psychological inquiry, psychoanalysis. The work of Freud, Jung, and their followers would take the insights gleaned from the trance state and turn them into the talking cure, seeking not to command the mind to sleep, but to free it from the internal conflicts that barred the door to rest. The battle against insomnia was thus fully engaged, swinging wildly between chemical sedation, physical imprisonment, and the deep, unsettling power of suggestion. The final frontier was clearly not the bloodstream, but the dark, intricate landscape of the American psyche. The narrative of American sleeplessness began as a physical affliction brought on by noise and industry, then quickly escalated into a moral crisis addressed by dangerous poisons or physical confinement. Yet for a distinct and influential segment of Victorian society, the educated, aspiring middle class, insomnia underwent a remarkable transformation. It inverted from a mark of medical failure to a badge of intellectual honor. In the late 19th century, to be sleepless, especially for the emergent new woman, was to possess a brain so fiercely engaged with the demands of modern civilization that it simply could not afford the luxury of rest. It was the ultimate, albeit pathological, status symbol. This curious glorification of exhaustion was rooted in the medical philosophy of neurasthenia, primarily championed by Dr. George Beard. As established, Beard theorized that the nervous system was a finite battery, rapidly depleted by the strain of modern life. But in America, a country obsessed with progress and intellectual superiority, this diagnosis carried an implicit social hierarchy. The most exhausting activity, according to Beard, was not manual labor, which drained crude physical energy, but cerebral effort, complex thought, emotional control, and the relentless pressure of professional life. Therefore, the person who was most afflicted by neurasthenia, the person who could not sleep, was, by definition, the person who was expending the greatest amount of precious nervous energy. Insomnia then became the visible, inconvenient proof of three things. High functioning. The sleepless person was engaged in work too significant for a common mind. They were the thinkers, the artists, the financiers, the reformers. Moral earnestness. The refusal of the mind to rest was a sign of moral diligence. Sleep suggested idleness. Wakefulness suggested tireless contribution to progress. Social status. Only those with the leisure and the educational privilege to perform non-manual, intellectual labor could truly suffer the high-status ailment of tired brain. The factory worker was tired. The intellectual was depleted. For the American intellectual, complaining of insomnia became a subtle, necessary boast. It was the verbal equivalent of a diploma or a bank statement, signaling their importance. The banker who closed a massive deal and then spent the night pacing his room was not sick. He was burdened by responsibility. The philosopher agonizing over a chapter at 3 a.m. was not disturbed. He was in the throes of genius. Initially, this high-status sleeplessness was primarily a masculine boast, tied to the cutthroat competition of the Gilded Age. The American businessman, striving to succeed in the relentless, standardized time of the industrial city, was expected to embody tireless ambition. The financier and the burden of the clock. Figures like railroad tycoons or Wall Street brokers often recounted their sleepless nights with a certain pride. The inability to sleep was proof that their mind was always on, calculating risks, assessing markets, and steering the nation's economic destiny. Their physical exhaustion was evidence of their immense cerebral workload, distinguishing them from the simpler lives of farmers or manual laborers. The writer and the stolen hours. Literary and artistic figures romanticized the sleepless night as the time when true creativity bloomed. The flickering gaslight or kerosene lamp became a symbol of intellectual resistance against the natural order. To write in the stolen hours after midnight was to prove one's devotion to one's craft, suggesting a level of commitment that physically healthy, well-rested minds could never achieve. Their pale complexion and twitching nerves were seen as stigmata of their contact with the sublime. This cultural acceptance provided a valuable defense mechanism for men. If they failed at their professional tasks, their neurasthenia could be cited as the cause, validating their struggle while affirming their intelligence. The illness confirmed their membership in the elite class of mental workers. The emergence of the new woman in the late 19th century, college-educated, politically conscious, and demanding professional access, fundamentally challenged the strict gender roles of Victorian America. She was determined to prove her intellectual equality with men, and surprisingly, the diagnosis of neurasthenia became one of her most potent, if dangerous, tools. The traditional ideal of femininity required women to be physically slight, emotionally stable, and confined to the domestic sphere. The new woman pushed back. She attended college, introducing the concept of the tired female student, rode bicycles, a shocking display of independent mobility and physical strength, and, critically, demanded the right to think and work outside the home. If neurasthenia was caused by intellectual overexertion, then for a woman to be diagnosed with it was a powerful, if perverse, victory. It was medical proof that her brain was active. Her mind was capable of the same high-level, energy-draining thought processes as a man's. She was not merely a physical vessel for reproduction and domesticity. She was a neurological engine. She was modern. She had sacrificed her body's natural state to participate in the pressures of modern, civilized life, a privilege historically reserved for men. She had earned her rest. Her exhaustion was legitimate, stemming from mental labor, not simply female complaints or a lack of moral fortitude. By publicly displaying their nervous exhaustion and sleepless nights, these women were claiming status. They were saying, "I cannot sleep because I have been thinking, studying, organizing, and striving just like a man. My sleeplessness is the price of my intellectual freedom." It was a bold declaration of parity, replacing the parlor's quiet modesty with the anxious vigor of the public sphere. This status symbol, however, was a double-edged sword, particularly for the women who claimed it. While it affirmed their mental capacity, it also provided the very grounds for their physical and social containment. The problem, in the eyes of the medical establishment, was that the female body was inherently weaker and less capable of sustaining this high intellectual output. The male neurasthenic was seen as a worn-out warrior. The female neurasthenic was seen as a defective instrument. This is where the medical judgment circled back to the patriarchal norm. When a man suffered from insomnia, he was advised to take a trip west or slow his business pace, a temporary hiatus before returning to his vital work. When a woman suffered from insomnia, she was subjected to the rest cure. The implicit medical logic was status. Your sleeplessness proves you are intelligent and ambitious. Prescription. Your intelligence is destroying your female body. We must eliminate the cause, your intellectual ambition, and force you back into physical passivity to heal your sex. Therefore, the sleeplessness that granted Charlotte Perkins Gilman the status of a legitimate thinker was also the same diagnosis that Dr. Weir Mitchell used to justify forbidding her from touching pen, brush, or pencil again. The status was granted only so it could be immediately stripped away. affirming the Victorian belief that true female excellence lay in physical stability, not cerebral exhaustion. The tired brain was acceptable, provided it was promptly forced into submission. The glorification of sleeplessness extended beyond medical diagnosis and into social ritual. The performance of fatigue became a recognizable social currency in urban, intellectual circles. The aesthetic of paleness. A delicate, slightly pale, and ethereal appearance, the look of the tired brain was considered refined, suggesting sensitivity and a mind preoccupied with higher things. This aesthetic stood in stark contrast to the robust, sun-tanned appearance of the laboring class. To look tired was to look sophisticated. The Diary of Woe. Personal diaries and letters became venues for competitive complaint. People documented their struggle to sleep with meticulous, almost boastful detail, using words like tormented, overwrought, and frantic. These records served not just as catharsis, but as documentation of their earnest, relentless inner life. To admit to a deep, unbroken sleep was almost an admission of being too simple or uncaring to participate in the age's intellectual turmoil. The hustle. Precedent. This Victorian attitude is the direct ancestor of modern hustle culture, where sleep deprivation is still proudly cited as proof of dedication and productivity. The 19th century insomniac, who claimed to work best during the quiet watch hours, laid the groundwork for the 21st century entrepreneur who boasts about surviving on 4 hours of sleep to show commitment. The romanticized view of insomnia as a necessary evil for the intelligent and ambitious class entrenched itself deep within the American psyche. It complicated the medical quest for a cure, as patients sometimes subconsciously resisted recovery because their sleeplessness had become integral to their identity. To admit to sleeping soundly was to risk losing status, to become less interesting, less sensitive, and less significant. The New Woman's Brief, defiant claim to the neurasthenic brain, was a vital moment in the history of female intellectual recognition, even if it was ultimately co-opted and weaponized by the medical establishment. Her tired brain and the ensuing struggle for rest highlighted the fundamental tension at the heart of the American project, a society that demanded endless, tireless ambition while simultaneously pathologizing the exhaustion that inevitably followed. This cultural framework ensured that even as doctors sought cures, whether chemical, physical, or hypnotic, a large swath of the educated public would continue to wear their sleeplessness as a sign of their elevated, anxious participation in the making of the modern world. The next step in the journey would involve the architecture of the home, as society finally realized that the solution might not be inside the patient's head, but in the environment they were trying so desperately to escape. By the 1880s, the American medical community faced a crisis in the treatment of chronic insomnia and its umbrella ailment, neurasthenia. The remedies were failing. Patent medicines, rife with opium and alcohol, were creating armies of addicts, and the authoritarian rest cure, though fashionable, was often psychologically devastating, as evidenced by the ordeal of writers like Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The failure of these chemical and physical approaches forced doctors to concede a profound truth. The ultimate battleground was not the body, but the mind. If the American nervous system was truly overwrought, its healing might require a subtle psychological intervention rather than a toxic sedative or forced submission. This intellectual vacuum was quickly filled by a controversial yet compelling practice that claimed to access the deepest recesses of the troubled mind: hypnotism, a direct descendant of the once derided mesmerism. The origins of hypnosis lay in the 18th century theories of Franz Mesmer. who proposed that an invisible fluidic force, animal magnetism, could be transferred from a healer to a patient to restore bodily harmony. Though Mesmer himself was largely dismissed as a fraud by the Parisian scientific community, the phenomenon of the trance state remained a fascination. By the mid-19th century in America, this practice evolved into mesmerism and then, through the work of European pioneers, solidified into scientific hypnotism. Hypnotism's appeal lay in its implicit promise, sleep without poison. In a society reeling from the consequences of addiction to over-the-counter narcotics, a non-chemical cure for sleeplessness held immense moral and practical weight. It offered a reprieve from the physical degradation of the opium den and the institutional cruelty of the rest-cure isolation ward. The neurasthenic patient, tormented by the ceaseless internal monologue of the tired brain, was the ideal candidate. Having failed repeatedly to will themselves to sleep, they were perfectly receptive to an external force that promised effortless mental surrender. Insomnia in this context was viewed not as a deficiency of nervous matter, but as a temporary failure of the conscious will to relinquish control. The doctors who adopted hypnosis, often drawing from the rival European schools of Nancy, emphasizing suggestion, and Salpêtrière, emphasizing neurological links to hysteria, saw their role change drastically. They were no longer simply administering doses. They were performing psychological surgery. The hypnotic treatment for the insomniac hinged on a structured process. The induction, the physician, in a quiet, darkened room, would guide the patient into a trance state. This was often done through monotonous speech, focusing on a fixed object or rhythmic repetition. The atmosphere itself was designed to contrast with the chaos of the industrial world. The command. Once suggestibility was achieved, the doctor would implant direct commands aimed at dismantling the core anxiety of insomnia. The suggestions were often simple and assertive. Your mind is now quiet. Your eyes are heavy. You will sleep deeply and calmly, not waking until morning. You are entirely rested. Post-hypnotic suggestion. The most critical component involved programming the patient's mind to maintain the sleep pattern after the session ended. These commands aim to restore the patient's sense of agency, instructing the subconscious to override the conscious anxiety loop. The patient was told they possessed the inner strength to command their own rest. The immediate relief could be miraculous. Patients who had experienced weeks of fragmented, anxious sleep would often sink into 4 to 5 hours of solid, consolidated rest during or immediately following the session. The relief confirmed the new, unsettling idea. The sleeplessness was entirely psychogenic, caused by the mind itself. The success of hypnotism illuminated the central psychological mechanism of Victorian sleeplessness. Performance anxiety. The Industrial Revolution had transformed sleep from a natural rhythm into a scheduled mandatory task, the 8-hour monophasic ideal. This created a disastrous loop. The more the insomniac tried to sleep, the more awake they became, terrified of failing the task. Hypnosis effectively broke this loop. By surrendering the responsibility for sleep to the hypnotist, the patient was momentarily freed from the conscious burden of trying. The act of sleep became passive again, achieved through submission rather than effort. The quiet interval that the Victorians now feared, the time alone with their thoughts in the darkness, was redefined by the hypnotist as a safe, controlled space. Furthermore, hypnotism became a tool for treating the deeper hysterical symptoms that often accompanied insomnia. By accessing the subconscious, doctors could address suppressed traumas, fears, and emotional repression, the very conflicts that the new woman generation was experiencing as they sought to expand their roles beyond the domestic sphere. The mind that was too busy and conflicted to rest was, for the first time, being systematically unburdened by a physician. Despite its therapeutic promise, hypnotism remained on the periphery of mainstream American medicine. This was due to several factors: association with quackery, its historical link to mesmerism, and its continued use on the theatrical stage tainted its medical credibility. Physicians feared being associated with showmen and charlatans. Moral anxiety over control. In a culture that prized self-reliance and willpower, the idea of surrendering the will to another person, even for healing, was ethically unsettling. This anxiety over mental manipulation led many patients and doctors to prefer the chemical certainty of a pill, however addictive, over the ambiguous power of suggestion. Temporary results. While acute insomnia often responded well to suggestion, the fundamental pressures of industrial life, the noise, the clock, the overwork, remained. Once the patient returned to their demanding environment, the post-hypnotic suggestions often faded, and the sleeplessness returned. Ultimately, the great contribution of hypnotism to the sleep crisis was not the cure itself, but the validation of the subconscious mind. It forced the medical community to acknowledge that sleeplessness was not merely a physical depletion, but a profound psychological symptom, a reflection of anxieties buried too deep for conscious access. The therapeutic failures of hypnotism directly paved the way for the rise of psychoanalysis. As doctors moved away from commanding the mind to sleep via suggestion, they moved toward understanding why it refused to rest. The stage trance gave way to the analyst's couch, shifting the goal from quick hypnotic relief to the long, difficult process of self-knowledge. In this sense, the mesmerizing doctor of the late Victorian era was the first psychologist to truly treat the American insomniac as a mind afflicted by civilization, not just a body lacking rest. The dawn of the 20th century, heralded by the soft, steady glow of the incandescent bulb, promised release from the shadows, disease, and nervous exhaustion of the Victorian past. Science had delivered barbiturates to control the body and architecture, to insulate the soul. The Great American Sleep Crisis, it was hoped, was merely a passing neurosis of a transitionary age. Yet as the decades passed, a chilling truth emerged. The problem had not been solved. It had simply evolved and accelerated. The persistent malady of the 1900s was no longer a vague case of neurasthenia, but a clinical, quantifiable epidemic of sleep debt and chronic fatigue. The defining characteristic of 20th century life was the unquestioned institutionalization of the monophasic sleep ideal. By the 1920s, the notion of the first sleep and second sleep had largely vanished, relegated to historical footnotes and folklore. The new standard, the demand for 8 continuous uninterrupted hours of sleep, was solidified by labor agreements, factory efficiency experts, and the very architecture of the modern bedroom. Sleep was now a performance metric, and anything less than perfect consolidation was seen as a sign of failure or, worse, disease. The cultural narrative shifted. Sleeplessness was no longer a sign of intellectual sensibility, as the new woman sometimes claimed, but a deficiency in discipline. The workplace, dominated by Taylorist efficiency models, demanded alert, focused employees for a full day of productive labor. The lack of sleep was reframed as a moral failure, and the anxious worker became the new insomniac archetype, terrified not just of the dark, but of the missed opportunity and lost productivity of the morning to come. The Victorian obsession with work was inherited by the 20th century and transformed into an obsession with speed and perpetual availability. Telephones, mass media, and the rapid pace of urban life ensured that the boundaries between work and rest, which the segmented sleeper once enjoyed, were completely eroded. Insomnia became inextricably linked to the American virtue of busyness. The individual who claimed to only need 4 or 5 hours of sleep became the professional ideal, a tireless dynamo capable of outworking the competition. This cultural glorification of sleep deprivation, a theme that would reappear with devastating force in the digital age, pushed people to voluntarily sacrifice rest for perceived career advancement. This relentless pace introduced a new psychological disorder: burnout. While neurasthenia focused on the physical depletion of the nervous system, burnout spoke to the psychological and emotional exhaustion caused by impossible demands and emotional labor. The 20th century patient was not just tired, they were cynical and detached, symptoms that sleep alone could not cure. The persistent problem of sleeplessness was no longer an isolated medical issue, but a sign of systemic breakdown in the national work-life balance. The early century reliance on barbiturates created a profound paradox. These powerful sedatives successfully induced sleep, but they did so by profoundly altering the nature of that sleep. Patients experienced less REM sleep, the phase linked to dreaming and memory consolidation, leading to a state often described as artificial sleep, hours spent unconscious, but not truly rested. The consequences of this pharmacological reliance were dire. Barbiturates were highly addictive and had a terrifyingly narrow therapeutic window. The difference between a hypnotic dose and a fatal one was small. This led to a wave of accidental and intentional overdoses, tragically highlighting that the cure for sleeplessness had become as dangerous as the disorder itself. It was this crisis that finally spurred formalized sleep science in the mid-20th century. The discovery of REM sleep in the 1950s, followed by the establishment of dedicated sleep labs, finally gave doctors the quantitative data they needed. The insomniac was no longer a nervous wreck. They were a subject whose brainwaves could be measured, recorded, and categorized in an electroencephalogram, EEG. This shift marked the end of the speculative Victorian era and the beginning of modern sleep medicine, validating the idea that quality of sleep, not just quantity, mattered. The second half of the 20th century introduced another massive disruptor: global air travel and the resulting chaos of the circadian rhythm. The invention of the jet engine and the speed of modern transportation allowed the American worker to literally outrun the sun, throwing the human body's internal clock into disarray. Jet lag became a metaphor for the century's entire sleep problem, a physical manifestation of the fact that the modern world was moving faster than human biology could adapt. The insomniac's struggle to adjust to time zones became a universal experience, demonstrating that the human body still craved the solar rhythm that the segmented sleeper once naturally followed, a rhythm now rendered irrelevant by the demands of a globalized economy. By the time the century closed, the nature of the sleep crisis was clear. It was no longer about escaping the dark. It was about escaping the relentless light and speed of a civilization built on the complete repudiation of rest. The solutions, new classes of hypnotics like benzodiazepines and later drugs, were safer than the barbiturates, but failed to address the root cultural cause: the relentless demand for an ever-present, hyper-productive self. The stage was set for the current crisis, where the only thing consistent about American rest was its persistent absence. The last quarter of the 19th century represented a medical crossroads. On one path lay the Victorian world of patent medicines, nostrums laced with indiscriminate doses of alcohol, opium, and cannabis, a crude, addictive system of self-medication that often killed the patient before it cured the insomnia. On the other path lay the gleaming promise of synthetic chemistry, the burgeoning field that sought to create pure, targeted molecules designed specifically to treat the nerves without the disastrous side effects of crude narcotics. This latter path led directly to the age of modern psychopharmacology, where the solution to sleeplessness was sought not in a plant extract, but in a test tube. Before the true synthetic age began, the medical community heavily relied on one compound for controlling the hyperactive Victorian nervous system: bromide. Bromide salts, such as potassium bromide, were recognized as effective sedatives, calming agents that worked by depressing the central nervous system. Bromides quickly became the primary pharmaceutical defense against the newly defined anxiety disorders, nervous exhaustion, and crucially, insomnia. Bromide compounds offered the medical establishment something the patent medicines could not: a sense of legitimacy and scientific control. They were prescribed by reputable doctors and sold in pharmacies, not via sensationalized advertisements. The drug permeated culture, becoming the go-to compound to calm the nerves. However, their long-term use was not without severe consequence. Chronic bromide intoxication, or bromism, led to a horrifying array of symptoms, including rashes, chronic headaches, psychosis, and severe neurological damage, proving that even scientific sedatives could be dangerous if used continuously to mask the underlying causes of the nation's sleeplessness. Bromism was an epidemic of its own, demonstrating that the medical community still lacked the precision required to safely command the mind into rest. The true revolution arrived at the turn of the century, originating in Germany's burgeoning chemical industry. In 1903, the compounds diethylbarbituric acid, quickly trademarked as Veronal and later Barbitol, burst onto the global market. These were the first true barbiturates, a new class of synthetic compounds that would dominate the sleep industry for the next 50 years. The arrival of barbiturates was greeted with euphoria by doctors and insomniacs alike. Veronal was touted as the perfect hypnotic, odorless, virtually tasteless, and capable of inducing a deep, consolidated sleep that, to the user, felt like a natural reprieve. Unlike the crude opium mixtures, Veronal was believed to be precise, acting directly on the inhibitory neurotransmitters in the brain to produce a predictable sedative effect. It delivered the consolidated 8-hour sleep that the industrial age had demanded and the Victorian nervous system craved. The success was instantaneous and global, but the consequences were slow and insidious. Barbiturates quickly proved to be highly addictive, creating a chemical dependency that was difficult to break. Furthermore, the drug possessed a notoriously narrow therapeutic window. The difference between the dose that induced sleep and the dose that caused respiratory depression, death, was agonizingly small. The spread of barbiturates through the 1910s, 20s and 30s created a quiet catastrophe across American society. For the average middle-class patient, these drugs became part of the nightly ritual, the chemical crutch necessary to meet the demands of the modern schedule. Addiction was rife, crossing all social boundaries. Doctors, believing the new compounds were safer than their predecessors, prescribed them liberally to manage all forms of anxiety and distress, inadvertently fueling a public health crisis. The barbiturate era is marked by a tragic increase in both accidental and intentional overdoses. The ease with which one could slip past the point of no return made them the drug of choice for suicide. And countless prominent figures, from Hollywood stars to frustrated writers, succumbed to their lethal potential. The sleeping pill, designed to be the ultimate escape from the agony of insomnia, became a perilous weapon. This high cost of chemical sleep forced a re-evaluation within the medical community. The shift from folk remedies to chemical synthesis was supposed to bring control and safety, yet it had delivered a dependency that was perhaps more dangerous than the crude narcotics of old. By the mid-20th century, the medical establishment knew the barbiturate era was unsustainable. The desperation for a better, safer hypnotic fueled the next stage of pharmacological research, leading to the development of benzodiazepines. The great promise of 1903 that chemistry could solve sleeplessness had devolved into a dangerous, systemic addiction, proving that no simple pill could alleviate the collective societal anxiety that lay at the heart of America's enduring sleep crisis. The enduring legacy of the Victorian sleep crisis is not just the problem of insomnia, but the radical, often bizarre ways in which the era attempted to solve it. After witnessing the rise and fall of segmented sleep, the tyranny of the clock, the chaos of patent medicines, and the strict control of the rest cure, we must ask, what did the Victorians truly understand about sleeplessness, and where did their desperate nervous energy lead them astray? Looking back from the vantage point of modern sleep science with its EEGs, neurochemistry, and behavioral therapy, the 19th century methods appear as a strange blend of intuition, genius, and dangerous folly. The primary failure of Victorian medicine, particularly in its approach to neurasthenia, was its rigid adherence to a physical, somatic explanation for what was fundamentally a psychological and environmental affliction. George Beard argued that nervous exhaustion was a depletion of a physical nerve force, a biological energy bank drained by the demands of civilization. This reductionist view led to severe therapeutic errors. The overemphasis on rest, the rest cure, the era's most notorious treatment, was born from the belief that if the body was physically still, the nerves would regenerate. Dr. Weir Mitchell enforced absolute isolation and total bed rest, essentially punishing the patient for their symptoms. We now know that complete physical inactivity is one of the worst things for chronic insomnia. Modern sleep medicine relies on sleep restriction therapy and stimulus control, which encourage activity when awake and associate the bed only with sleep. The Victorian doctor confined the patient to bed. The modern therapist tells them to get out of it. The chemical quick fix, the reliance on bromides, and later, barbiturates stemmed from the belief that the problem was a chemical imbalance that could be chemically overpowered. As Chapter 8 detailed, this led to widespread addiction and tragedy. They substituted one form of physical distress, sleeplessness, for a far greater one, chemical dependency and overdose risk. Despite their monumental failures, the Victorians stumbled upon several truths that resonate deeply with modern behavioral science. Their intuitive understanding of the environment and the power of the mind predates formalized psychology. The power of light and darkness. When early Americans were forced by necessity to retreat into darkness, they practiced segmented sleep. The Victorians, instinctively linking illness to urban life, began building sleeping porches and emphasizing sanitation and fresh air in the bedroom. They were reacting to the toxic, overlit, and noisy city, understanding, even without knowing about the pituitary gland, that the environment was toxic to rest. Modern sleep hygiene is fundamentally an architectural and environmental practice, focused on eliminating blue light, reducing noise, and controlling temperature. The Victorians were right to insist that rest required a controlled, dark, and clean sanctuary. The psychosomatic connection, the hypnotists, the hypnotic movement, though often associated with charlatanism, represented an understanding that the mind could be commanded. It implicitly acknowledged that the insomniac's failure to sleep was often rooted in anxiety and rumination, a pattern of thought the patient could not break. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, relies on similar principles, disrupting negative thought patterns and consciously reassociating the bed with safety and rest. The Victorian hypnotist used suggestion to command sleep. The modern CBTI therapist uses mental exercises to retrain the brain. The methodology differs, but the target, the anxious, unrestrained mind, is the same. Perhaps the most prescient aspect of the Victorian diagnosis, particularly in the work of Beard and the concept of the new woman, was the recognition that the problem was social, not individual. They correctly identified that the Industrial Revolution created a culture that systematically demanded sleeplessness through standardized time. The clock replaced the sun, making sleep a fixed block of time to be maximized rather than a flexible, natural rhythm, productivity. As virtue, the glorification of work meant that rest became morally suspect. Sleeplessness, in this view, was the expected badge of honor for the civilized, successful citizen. The Victorians were the first to medicalize this cultural demand. While their treatments, rest cure, bromides, were brutal or ineffective, their initial analysis was correct. America was demanding a nervous system that could not keep pace with its civilization. Ultimately, the Victorian cures failed because they treated the symptom, the tired body, and not the underlying disease, which was the cultural imperative to never stop. The legacy of the 19th century is a persistent struggle, a world where we continue to seek a perfect pill or a perfect room, only to realize that true rest requires dismantling the very structures of speed and productivity that the American century was built upon. 2 centuries after the clock began its tyrannical rule, and more than 150 years after the first doctor diagnosed nervous exhaustion, America remains restless. The historical struggle to command sleep, chronicled through segmented nights, industrial whistles, quack potions, enforced bed rest, has culminated not in a cure, but in a crisis that is larger, faster, and more technologically sophisticated than the Victorians could have ever imagined. The modern insomniac may carry a different title, but their agony is the enduring legacy of the Great American Sleep Epidemic, the neurasthenia of the 19th century, the depletion of vital nerve force caused by the speed of modern life, is reborn in the 21st as chronic anxiety and burnout. The urban clamor that once drove Victorians to construct quiet sleeping porches has been replaced by the pervasive portable glow of the screen. The modern bed is no longer just a place of rest. It is an extension of the office, the social network, and the entertainment system. Where the gaslight once stretched the evening an hour or two, the smartphone with its blue light emitting display delays the natural release of melatonin indefinitely. This constant artificial illumination ensures that the first sleep is pushed ever later. The potential for restorative segmented rest is fully extinguished, and the anxious, overstimulated mind is perpetually tethered to the global clock. The Victorian fear of falling behind on the farm or factory floor has transmuted into the modern fear of missing out, FOMO, and the relentless pressure of the 24/7 economy. We are a culture that valorizes the hustle, where exhaustion is still quietly worn as a badge of honor. The overworked millennial, fueled by caffeine and guilt, is the direct descendant of the frantic Victorian clerk, trapped in a schedule designed to ignore the body's natural limits. In the absence of a collective, societal solution, the battle against sleep deprivation has become deeply privatized and commercialized, echoing the Wild West of the patent medicine era. Today's sleep aids are scientifically safer than bromide or chloral hydrate, but they still represent the ultimate quick fix, pharmaceutical fixes. Though barbiturates are gone, Benzodiazepines and non-benzodiazepine hypnotics, Z drugs, remain staples, promising to deliver that elusive 8-hour block. Yet they often still fail to produce truly restorative sleep, creating chemical dependency that the Victorians would recognize instantly. The wearable tech economy. Millions are spent annually on wearable devices, apps and gadgets that track, score, and optimize sleep. This technology, while insightful, ultimately turns rest into another performance metric, a competitive field to be mastered. The modern insomniac doesn't just worry about sleeping. They worry about how well their app says they slept, adding a layer of quantified anxiety to an already stressful condition. Melatonin and natural aids. The explosion of unregulated supplements like melatonin mirrors the Victorian reliance on soothing syrups. These products are often taken indiscriminately, without medical guidance, in a frantic hope that a simple substance will correct a deep, systemic behavioral problem. The cure for the Great American Sleep Epidemic lies not in more complex pills or more detailed data, but in acknowledging the historical lesson the Victorians provided. Insomnia is a social disease disguised as an individual medical problem. The most successful contemporary treatment is not pharmacological, but behavioral. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. Its core tenets: disrupting negative thought patterns, controlling the environment, and rigorously associating the bed only with sleep, are a highly formalized version of the accidental truths discovered by the hypnotists and the architects of the 19th century. The ultimate unfinished story is the battle to reclaim the night. It requires a collective cultural shift, a deliberate revolutionary deceleration of life. It means rejecting the tyranny of the continuous 8-hour expectation, demanding limits on digital availability, and valuing rest not as a reward for work, but as a foundational human need. From the quiet contemplation of the segmented sleeper's midnight watch to the frantic, scrolling anxiety of the 21st century insomniac, the history of American rest is a testament to the persistent human desire for peace. The final cure will not be a Victorian panacea or a digital innovation, but a simple, difficult choice to turn off the lights, mute the demands of the world, and allow the ancient, natural rhythm of the body to finally return.